The wedding invitation that arrived at Anita Reddy's childhood home in Hyderabad on a humid September morning in 2019 was embossed with gold lettering and featured intricate peacock designs representing prosperity and marital bliss, promising a future filled with the traditional happiness that every Indian family dreams of for their daughters. The 25-year-old pharmacist never imagined that accepting this marriage proposal from Vikram Reddy, a 29-year-old accountant in Delhi, would lead her into a psychological nightmare, beginning just 12 days after their lavish 3-day wedding celebration, attended by over 700 guests, who showered them with blessings and traditional gifts, symbolizing fertility, prosperity, and eternal devotion. The arranged marriage had followed traditional protocols that both families believed provided protection against incompatibility and deception, with multiple meetings between the prospective couple, thorough background investigations conducted through trusted community networks, and careful verification of professional credentials and family reputation. Anita's parents, Ramesh and Lakshmi Reddy, had been particularly careful in evaluating Vikram's suitability, conducting inquiries through their extensive network of business associates and family friends that confirmed he came from a respectable family with strong values, maintained excellent employment with steady advancement potential, owned his own flat in a desirable Delhi neighborhood, and expressed genuine enthusiasm about building a life with their educated and accomplished daughter, who represented everything they had worked to provide through years of sacrifice and investment in her future. The courtship period had seemed to confirm the wisdom of the match, with Vikram traveling from Delhi to Hyderabad multiple times over 4 months, engaging in thoughtful conversations about their hopes for married life, their shared values about balancing career ambitions with family responsibilities, and demonstrating the kind of respectful attention that reassured everyone this union would flourish. The chemistry between them developed naturally despite the formal structure of their meetings, with Anita genuinely attracted to his apparent sincerity, his thoughtful questions about her career, ambitions, and personal dreams, and his expressions of excitement about building a partnership that would balance tradition with equality while honoring both their professional aspirations and their commitment to creating a warm family environment for future children. The wedding was a spectacular demonstration of both families' social standing and their deep investment in creating an auspicious beginning for the young couple's shared journey, with ceremonies conducted according to ancient Vedic traditions, while incorporating modern elements that reflected their cosmopolitan identities as educated urban Indians. The 3 days included elaborate rituals performed by Brahmin priests, chanting Sanskrit verses promising divine blessings for fertility, prosperity, and eternal devotion, while hundreds of guests from both extended families consumed catered meals costing nearly 20 lakh rupees that featured regional specialties from both Hyderabad and Delhi, symbolizing the beautiful merging of two distinct family cultures into what everyone believed would be a unified and harmonious future built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The honeymoon in Kerala backwaters was postponed due to Vikram's urgent work commitments involving year-end financial reporting that could not be delegated, which seemed entirely reasonable to Anita despite her disappointment about delaying the romantic interlude she had anticipated. The move from Hyderabad to Delhi was emotionally difficult, as she left behind not only her parents and extended family, but also the successful pharmacy career she had built over 4 years at a respected hospital, where her colleagues valued her expertise and her patients appreciated her compassionate approach to healthcare consultation and medication counseling. The sacrifice represented traditional expectations that many Indian brides accepted as part of their marital duty, though modern women like Anita approached these transitions with mixed feelings about abandoning hard-won professional achievements for the uncertain prospect of rebuilding careers in unfamiliar cities where they lacked professional networks and established reputations. Vikram's 2-bedroom apartment in Greater Noida offered modern amenities and contemporary furnishings, but lacked the community networks and cultural richness of Hyderabad's older neighborhoods, where multiple generations maintained close connections. Anita noticed immediately that the space contained no family photographs or personal mementos that might have provided insights into his emotional life or his connections to people who had shaped his identity. The first 12 days established confusing patterns that troubled her intuition, with Vikram leaving early each morning for his accounting firm and returning late in the evening, often after 10 o'clock, claiming that end-of-quarter financial reporting demanded extended hours that prevented him from spending quality time with his new bride during the crucial adjustment period, when couples traditionally focused on building emotional and physical intimacy that would sustain them through future challenges. Anita felt increasingly isolated in the unfamiliar city, spending long days alone in the apartment while submitting applications for pharmacy positions at Delhi hospitals that might eventually allow her to rebuild the professional identity she had sacrificed by relocating for marriage. The discovery that would shatter Anita's understanding of her marriage and transform her emotional reality occurred on the 12th day after their wedding, when she was organizing Vikram's home office to create space for her own professional documents and certification materials. His laptop sat open and unlocked on the desk, displaying an email inbox that contained messages. Anita initially tried to ignore out of respect for his privacy, though her attention was captured by a subject line reading, "Missing you already, my love," from a sender identified as Meera Sharma, a name that meant nothing to Anita, but carried implications that made her heart race with sudden anxiety about what these words might reveal about her husband's secret emotional life. The internal struggle that Anita experienced in that moment reflected the collision between traditional values about respecting spousal privacy and modern awareness that wives had legitimate rights to understand whether their husbands were maintaining appropriate boundaries in relationships with other women. The decision to read the email violated trust she desperately wanted to maintain in her marriage, but the provocative subject line and affectionate language suggested secrets that no wife should be expected to tolerate or ignore, creating a moral dilemma that was ultimately resolved by her need to protect herself from potential deception that could undermine everything she had sacrificed by leaving her career and family to build a life with this man she was only beginning to know. The email that Anita opened with trembling hands contained language that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation about the nature of the relationship between Vikram and this woman named Meera, with explicit references to intimate moments they had shared just days before his wedding to Anita, passionate expressions of longing for physical contact that violated every boundary that should have existed between a committed man and another woman, and casual mentions of future plans to meet that suggested this affair would continue seamlessly, despite Vikram's new marital status and the sacred vows he had made before hundreds of witnesses and religious authorities who had blessed their union. The systematic exploration of Vikram's email archives that followed Anita's initial discovery revealed the truly comprehensive nature of his deception, with hundreds of messages spanning back 3 years, documenting a relationship that included regular meetings at hotels throughout Delhi, elaborate lies told to family members about business trips and work obligations that were actually romantic getaways to Goa and Jaipur, and detailed discussions about how Vikram planned to manage both his marriage to Anita and his continuing affair with Meera by maintaining careful compartmentalization between his public life as a respectable married man and his private indulgence in what he described to Meera as his authentic emotional life that transcended conventional social expectations and family obligations. The messages that had been exchanged during the weeks immediately before and after the wedding were particularly devastating, revealing that Vikram had been communicating with Meera even during the 3-day ceremony, while Anita and both families celebrated what they believed was the beginning of a sacred union blessed by religious rituals and family approval. The casual tone of these messages suggested that Vikram felt no guilt whatsoever about deceiving everyone involved in the wedding, instead treating the elaborate celebration as merely an inconvenient social obligation that he needed to endure before returning to what he characterized as his true emotional life with the woman who genuinely understood him and shared his real values. Photographs in a hidden folder provided visual confirmation of the ongoing nature of his relationship with Meera, showing the couple in intimate embraces at restaurants and hotels, with timestamps indicating that some of these images had been taken just days before Vikram had traveled to Hyderabad for pre-wedding ceremonies, where he had looked into Anita's eyes and promised eternal devotion while participating in sacred rituals. The contrast between his public performance as an eager bridegroom and his private reality as a man who had no intention whatsoever of ending his extramarital relationship created a cognitive dissonance that made Anita question everything. She believed she knew about human nature, trustworthiness, and the reliability of traditional systems that were supposed to protect young women from exactly this kind of calculated betrayal and systematic exploitation. The emotional impact of these discoveries was so overwhelming that Anita remained physically unable to move from the desk chair for nearly an hour, as waves of humiliation, rage, grief, and disbelief crashed over her consciousness, while she struggled to process the magnitude of the deception that had been perpetrated not only against her, but also against both families, who had invested tremendous emotional energy, financial resources, into creating a marriage that was apparently nothing more than a cynical performance designed to satisfy social expectations while allowing Vikram to maintain his secret life. The realization that her parents' careful investigations had been completely inadequate to detect this level of systematic dishonesty created additional layers of pain as she recognized how thoroughly Vikram had manipulated everyone involved through his sophisticated ability to present himself as exactly the kind of respectable young man that traditional families trusted with their daughters' futures and happiness. The hours that Anita spent waiting for Vikram's return that evening were filled with alternating waves of fury and strategic calculation as she considered various approaches to confronting him about his affair, while also beginning to formulate plans for how she would protect herself from the emotional and social consequences of his betrayal. Her pharmaceutical training that had taught her to analyze complex medical situations systematically and develop evidence-based solutions to patient problems now served an entirely different purpose as she mentally organized the documentation she had discovered, anticipated Vikram's likely responses and denials, and prepared herself for the psychological warfare that would inevitably follow when she forced him to acknowledge that his carefully constructed deception had been exposed just 12 days into their marriage. The sound of Vikram's key in the lock at 9:30 that evening triggered a physical response in Anita's body that felt like every nerve ending was suddenly electrified with the massive adrenaline surge necessary for confrontation, though she forced herself to remain seated on the living room sofa, where she had positioned herself with his laptop open to display the most damning evidence of his ongoing communication with Mira. The expression on Vikram's face as he entered the flat and saw his wife sitting in dim lamplight with his computer was one of immediate recognition that his secret had been discovered, followed by a rapid succession of emotions, including fear about the consequences he would face, calculation about how he might minimize damage to his reputation, and what appeared to be resignation about the inevitable conversation that would force him to either defend his completely indefensible actions or attempt to manipulate Anita into accepting his betrayal as somehow compatible with their marriage. The initial 30-second silence that stretched between them represented their marriage's final moment as Anita had understood it until that afternoon, with both of them recognizing that whatever words were spoken next would fundamentally alter their relationship forever and determine whether any possibility existed for reconciliation or whether this discovery would lead to immediate separation and the public humiliation that would accompany admitting to both families that their elaborate wedding had celebrated a union that was fraudulent from its very inception. The question she finally asked was delivered with remarkable calmness, considering the emotional turmoil she had experienced throughout the afternoon. "How long were you planning to continue your relationship with Mira while pretending to be a faithful husband to me?" Vikram's response, after a long pause, revealed both his fundamental character flaws and his sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation, as he attempted to reframe his betrayal as a complicated situation that arose from family pressures, forcing him into an arranged marriage he had never genuinely wanted, while his true emotions remained committed to Mira, whom he described as his soulmate in ways that suggested Anita should somehow sympathize with his difficult position rather than focusing on the systematic deception he had employed. The sheer audacity of this approach stunned Anita into momentary silence as she processed his attempt to position himself as a victim of circumstances rather than as the architect of elaborate fraud who had knowingly destroyed multiple lives through his selfish refusal to either end his affair or decline the arranged marriage. His detailed confession that followed revealed planning and premeditation that made his betrayal even more devastating than Anita had understood from reading his emails alone, with acknowledgement that he had actively pursued the arranged marriage process while maintaining his relationship with Mira because he wanted the social respectability and family approval that came with marrying a suitable bride from his community while continuing to indulge what he characterized as passionate romance that he genuinely believed could coexist with his marital obligations if Anita would simply accept reality and allow him to maintain both relationships simultaneously without creating unnecessary drama or complications. The casual way that Vikram presented this proposal for what amounted to sanctioned adultery demonstrated his fundamental lack of respect for Anita's dignity, autonomy, and emotional well-being, as he seemed genuinely confused about why she would object to an arrangement that he had apparently convinced himself was entirely reasonable. Anita's rage that finally exploded in response to Vikram's grotesque proposal was expressed not through physical violence, but through verbal devastation that systematically dismantled his self-serving narrative by highlighting the comprehensive nature of his fraud against her, against both families, and against the sacred traditions that were supposed to govern arranged marriages. Vikram's counterattack abandoned his initial manipulation attempts in favor of deliberately cruel statements, suggesting she should feel grateful he had agreed to marry her at all, implying her role was merely maintaining his public image, while Meera met his genuine emotional and physical needs. Anita's decision during the confrontation to document Vikram's confession using her phone's voice recording application represented tactical awareness that whatever emotional resolution occurred in their private conversation, she would ultimately need solid evidence to support her position when explaining the situation to family members, who would inevitably question why such a recent marriage was being challenged or dissolved. The recording captured not only Vikram's clear admission of his ongoing affair and his shocking proposal that Anita accept this arrangement as normal, but also his cruel statements about her inferior status compared to his mistress, creating comprehensive documentation that would protect Anita from potential accusations that she was somehow responsible for the marriage's failure. Vikram's threat when he realized Anita was recording their conversation revealed the extreme lengths to which he would go to protect his reputation and avoid facing consequences for his actions, as he warned that any public exposure of his affair would result in deliberate social retaliation against her entire family in ways that would damage her parents' standing in their Hyderabad community and potentially affect her father's important business relationships that depended on maintaining respectability. This transparent attempt at intimidation through threatening collective punishment of Anita's innocent family members demonstrated Vikram's sophisticated understanding of the social dynamics that often succeeded in silencing victims of marital betrayal in traditional communities. Anita's response to Vikram's threats revealed inner strength that had been forged through her professional training and her parents' encouragement of independence, despite traditional cultural frameworks, as she made absolutely clear that she would not be intimidated into silence or complicity with his betrayal, regardless of whatever social consequences might follow from honest disclosure of his systematic deception and ongoing affair. The calm determination with which she delivered this message seemed to genuinely surprise Vikram, who had apparently expected that invoking potential damage to her family's reputation would successfully manipulate her into accepting his terms. The escalation that followed Anita's refusal to be intimidated included Vikram's increasingly desperate attempts to physically prevent her from leaving the apartment with her phone and the damning evidence she had gathered, grabbing her arm forcefully and attempting to wrestle the device from her possession while making threats about the severe consequences she would face if she exposed his relationship with Meera to family members or friends. The terror that Anita experienced during these moments of physical intimidation was amplified by her recognition that she was completely isolated in an unfamiliar city without immediate access to family support or police protection. She managed escape by threatening to scream and alert neighbors about domestic violence occurring in the apartment, which forced Vikram to release her and step back, creating just enough space for her to grab essential belongings and her passport before fleeing to the building's lobby, where security guards and public visibility would provide some protection from further intimidation. The decision to immediately leave the marital home just 12 days after moving in represented both practical safety concerns and symbolic rejection of any possibility this marriage could be salvaged. The phone call to her parents from the lobby was one of the most difficult conversations she had ever experienced, struggling through tears and barely controlled panic to explain that the marriage they had celebrated just days earlier with such joy and investment had been revealed as complete fraud, perpetrated by a man who had maintained a secret relationship throughout their courtship and wedding. Her parents' shock was followed by immediate expressions of support and urgent demands. she take a taxi directly to the airport and book the first available flight back to Hyderabad. The journey to the airport represented physical manifestation of her psychological transition from naive bride who had trusted traditional processes to protect her, to traumatized survivor who now understood that no amount of family investigation or careful courtship could guarantee protection against sophisticated predators. The emotional numbness during the taxi ride reflected protective shutdown when psychological pain exceeded normal processing capacity. The reunion at Hyderabad Airport in the early morning hours was marked by emotional intensity, reflecting relief about her physical safety, but also shared recognition that the marriage they had celebrated with such pride had been revealed as catastrophic mistake enabled by Vikram's sophisticated deception and both families' insufficient investigation into his true character. The embrace that lasted several minutes represented comfort and protection, but also acknowledgement of shared failure to detect warning signs that might have been present during courtship. The evidence Anita presented once they returned home included not only the voice recording of her confrontation with Vikram, but also the emails and photographs she had transferred to her phone, creating comprehensive documentation that eliminated any possibility this situation represented mere misunderstanding or cultural differences about acceptable relationships outside marriage. Her father's fury, as he reviewed this material, reflected both paternal protection and personal recognition. He had been deceived by Vikram's performance during courtship when the young accountant had looked him directly in the eyes and promised to honor and protect Anita. Strategic planning during the first hours focused on immediate legal actions protecting her interests, while considering social implications of exposing Vikram's betrayal to extended family networks and community members who had attended the wedding. The lawyer her father contacted provided guidance about annulment procedures preferable to divorce given the brief duration and clear evidence of fraud, though warning that pursuing legal remedies would inevitably result in public disclosure affecting both families' reputations within their traditional community where failed marriages carried significant stigma. Anita's decision to prioritize truth and justice over reputation management reflected her deep conviction that remaining silent about Vikram's betrayal would enable him to continue deceiving other women, while also implicitly accepting that his threats about social retaliation should successfully intimidate victims into protecting their abusers from appropriate consequences. The strength required to maintain this position, despite pressure from some extended family members who worried about scandal affecting the family's social standing, demonstrated her recognition that her own healing and future well-being depended absolutely on refusing to internalize shame or responsibility for Vikram's criminal deception. The confrontation between the two families occurred 3 days after Anita's return to Hyderabad, when Vikram's parents traveled south at the firm insistence of her father, who demanded face-to-face accountability for their son's actions and clarification about whether they had been aware of his existing relationship when they proposed the marriage match. The meeting in the Reddy family's formal living room was marked by initial defensive posturing from Vikram's parents, until they were confronted with specific evidence from emails showing the affair had continued during wedding ceremonies, forcing acknowledgement their son had committed serious fraud. A devastating revelation emerged when Vikram's mother eventually admitted under sustained pressure that she had been vaguely aware her son had been involved in some kind of relationship with someone before arranged marriage. Discussions began, though she claimed to have believed he would naturally end this connection once he was properly married to a suitable bride. This disclosure meant the investigation had been undermined not only by Vikram's active deception, but also by his family's strategic concealment of information that absolutely should have been disclosed during marriage negotiations. The demand for complete dowry return, including jewelry valued at 8 lakh rupees, cash gifts totaling 5 lakh rupees, and household items worth an additional 3 lakh rupees, created immediate financial conflict that added practical dimensions to the emotional devastation both families were experiencing. The initial resistance revealed economic motivations that sometimes influenced arranged marriage decisions. The police report that Anita filed documented not only Vikram's fraud in contracting marriage while maintaining another relationship, but also his physical intimidation and attempts to prevent her from leaving with evidence of his betrayal, creating potential criminal liability beyond the civil issues related to annulment and dowry return. The decision to pursue criminal charges represented escalation some family members questioned, though Anita's lawyer argued establishing official documentation would provide crucial protection while potentially deterring similar fraud by other men. The psychological impact of Vikram's betrayal manifested in Anita's daily life through severe symptoms, including insomnia that left her exhausted, loss of appetite that resulted in noticeable weight loss, difficulty concentrating on even simple tasks, and constant intrusive thoughts about the systematic nature of his deception that made her question her fundamental judgment about human character and her ability to trust her own perceptions. The trauma that accompanied discovering her most intimate relationship had been built entirely on lies, while another woman possessed her husband's genuine affection, created wounds extending far beyond typical heartbreak to include existential questions about her own worth and desirability, despite her rational understanding that Vikram's betrayal reflected his character flaws rather than any inadequacy in her qualities as a partner. Therapy, with a psychologist specializing in relationship trauma, provided crucial safe space for processing the complex emotions flooding her consciousness, including shame about having been deceived despite her intelligence and education, rage at Vikram's cruelty and calculated manipulation, grief about the loss of the imagined future she had begun building in her mind during courtship and early marriage, and profound confusion about how to navigate social situations where people asked about her husband or commented on what they believed had been a beautiful wedding, celebrating genuine love. Contact from Meera Sharma 3 weeks after fleeing Delhi represented an unexpected and shocking escalation that added new dimensions to her understanding of the comprehensive deception that Vikram had perpetrated. The Instagram direct message was startlingly confrontational, with the boutique owner, who had been Vikram's mistress, actually accusing Anita of destroying her relationship by forcing Vikram into an unwanted marriage, and brazenly suggesting that Anita should simply accept her position as the legal wife who served social functions, while allowing Meera to continue providing the romantic and sexual fulfillment that Vikram genuinely desired from their authentic connection. The sheer audacity of this communication stunned Anita into momentary paralysis as she processed the implication that she was somehow the villain in a situation where she had been systematically deceived and betrayed. The response Anita eventually composed after consulting with both her therapist and lawyer struck a careful balance between expressing her justified rage and avoiding any statements that might complicate her legal position or provide ammunition for Vikram and Meera to claim she had made threats or engaged in harassment. The message made absolutely clear that she held both Vikram and Meera equally responsible for fraud that had devastated multiple families, and that whatever arrangement they had imagined could continue after the wedding had been permanently destroyed by her refusal to participate in her own humiliation by accepting a position as unwitting cover for their ongoing affair. Discovery through a mutual acquaintance revealed additional layers of premeditation and calculated cruelty in how Vikram and his mistress had approached the entire situation. As Anita learned, the couple had discussed in specific detail how Vikram would successfully manage both relationships simultaneously, with Meera apparently entirely comfortable with the arrangement as long as she remained his primary emotional and romantic partner, while the legal wife handled family obligations and social appearances. This evidence of conscious planning between the two of them to exploit Anita for their convenience transformed her understanding from an unfortunate situation where a weak man had failed to end a previous relationship into a calculated conspiracy where two people had actively plotted to defraud her of agency, dignity, and the authentic marriage she deserved. Social media investigation into Meera's background and public presence revealed a lifestyle of conspicuous consumption and social performance that seemed designed to project an image of independence and sophistication, with her Instagram account featuring photographs from expensive restaurants, luxury shopping experiences, and travel to fashionable destinations that suggested financial resources substantially exceeding what a small boutique business in Delhi might typically generate. Examination of posts revealed occasional subtle references to a mysterious partner whose face was never shown, but whose presence was implied through couples' activities and romantic settings. The pattern from analyzing dates and content of Meera's social media posts created a devastating timeline, showing exactly how Vikram had divided his time and attention between the two women, with concrete evidence that he had spent evenings and weekends with his mistress, even during the period when he was supposedly occupied with urgent work obligations. Specific dates when he had claimed end-of-quarter pressures corresponded precisely with Mira's posts, showing romantic dinners and intimate moments, providing absolute proof the isolation and loneliness Anita experienced during her first weeks in Delhi had been deliberately manufactured through systematic lies that allowed Vikram to maintain his primary relationship with Mira, while treating his legal wife as an inconvenient obligation requiring minimal time investment. Legal proceedings for annulment moved forward with reluctant cooperation from Vikram's family, who gradually recognized that prolonging the process would only increase public scrutiny and potential criminal liability for their son's documented fraud and physical intimidation of his wife. When she discovered his ongoing affair just days after their wedding, negotiations over financial settlements included not only complete return of dowry but also substantial additional compensation for Anita's professional losses, resulting from her relocation to Delhi and the significant career disruption caused by the fraudulent marriage, with her lawyer successfully arguing she deserved substantial damages, reflecting the comprehensive nature of the deception perpetrated through Vikram's systematic lies and his family's strategic concealment of information about his existing relationship commitments. Testimony that Anita provided during legal proceedings required her to relive deeply traumatic memories in excruciating detail, while describing intimate aspects of discovering the affair and Vikram's violent response to being confronted, creating additional emotional burden on top of the severe psychological damage she was already processing through therapy and family support. The necessity of maintaining composure while recounting these experiences for legal documentation meant suppressing natural emotional responses in favor of clear factual presentation. Vikram's legal defense included systematic character assassination, suggesting Anita had been overly suspicious and controlling from the start, that she had violated his privacy by reading his emails without permission, and that her decision to flee Delhi rather than attempting marriage counseling demonstrated unwillingness to work through normal relationship challenges that all couples faced during adjustment to married life. These arguments represented strategic attempts to shift blame from perpetrator to victim by reframing her justified responses to his documented betrayal as evidence of alleged character flaws, though his position was severely undermined by the recorded confession and extensive documentary evidence, proving his affair had continued throughout their entire courtship and wedding. Public attention through local media coverage in both Hyderabad and Delhi brought unwanted scrutiny to both families while also creating unexpected opportunities for important conversations about fraud in arranged marriages and the particular vulnerability of young women who trusted traditional processes to protect them from predatory men. Interviews Anita eventually agreed to provide for women's advocacy organizations allowed her to transform her personal tragedy into educational material that might help other potential victims recognize warning signs and understand their legal rights when discovering that husbands had deceived them about fundamental facts regarding their commitment to monogamous marriage. The support network that developed around Anita through these advocacy connections included other women who had experienced various forms of marital fraud and betrayal, creating community bonds that provided both emotional validation and practical guidance for navigating the complex intersection of legal proceedings, family dynamics, and social judgment that victims faced when refusing to remain silent about their experiences. These relationships demonstrated that growing numbers of educated modern Indian women were rejecting traditional expectations to accept mistreatment in favor of prioritizing dignity and demanding accountability from men who violated basic standards of honesty and respect within marriage. Investigation into Mira's specific role revealed that while she had not been directly involved in marriage negotiations or wedding ceremonies, her active participation in planning how the affair would continue after Vikram's marriage created potential civil liability for intentional infliction of emotional distress and conspiracy to commit fraud against Anita. Evidence of her confrontational message combined with testimony about detailed discussions she had engaged in with Vikram about managing both relationships simultaneously demonstrated full consciousness of wrongdoing and deliberate choice to participate in deceiving and harming an innocent woman. Financial investigation revealed Vikram had spent substantial amounts of money on expensive gifts, luxury travel, and elaborate entertainment for Mira during the same period when he was accepting dowry from Anita's family and making promises about building a secure financial future together, providing additional, compelling evidence of systematic fraud. The emotional toll of participating in extended legal proceedings while simultaneously processing trauma and attempting to rebuild her professional life created overwhelming stress that manifested in physical symptoms, including chronic headaches, digestive problems, and immune system weakness that resulted in frequent minor illnesses, reflecting her body's expression of severe psychological distress. The annulment that was finally granted 8 months after Anita's escape from Delhi included substantial financial judgment in her favor, totaling over 25 lakh rupees. Though the emotional vindication of legal recognition that she had been systematically defrauded could never adequately compensate for the psychological damage and career disruption she had experienced through Vikram's calculated betrayal. Official documentation declaring the marriage void from inception due to fraud in its procurement provided some comfort by establishing clear legal record that the failure of this union resulted entirely from Vikram's deception, rather than from any inadequacy or wrongdoing on Anita's part, though she recognized that social stigma about failed marriages would likely follow her regardless of whose fault the dissolution truly represented. Relocating to Bangalore rather than remaining in Hyderabad reflected her deep need for a fresh start in a city where she would not constantly encounter people who had attended her elaborate wedding or who possessed strong opinions about the scandal that had unfolded when the marriage dissolved so quickly after what everyone had believed were authentic celebrations. The pharmacy position she secured at a prominent hospital in Bangalore's Indiranagar neighborhood represented professional recovery and precious opportunity to rebuild the career momentum that had been sacrificed when she relocated to Delhi for what she believed would be a lifelong partnership, but instead became a traumatic 8-month detour that had cost her valuable professional development and left lasting scars on her ability to trust other representations about their intentions and character. The relationship that Anita developed with Priya, a colleague at the Bangalore hospital who had also experienced devastating betrayal in an arranged marriage several years earlier, provided crucial emotional support and validation that helped her process ongoing anger and grief about how the traditional systems that were supposed to protect young women had instead failed so completely to detect Vikram's sophisticated fraud. The friendship that developed between these two survivors of marital deception created genuinely safe space for expressing rage and disappointment without fear of judgment, while also allowing them to support each other through the gradual process of rebuilding confidence in their own judgment and their capacity to eventually form authentic, trusting relationships, despite having been so thoroughly deceived by men who had skillfully exploited their vulnerability and cultural expectations for their own selfish purposes. Therapy work that continued in Bangalore focused specifically on helping Anita separate her core identity and self-worth from Vikram's betrayal, while also processing the complex ways that traditional cultural frameworks had contributed to her vulnerability by encouraging young women to prioritize family approval and social respectability over careful evaluation of potential partners' genuine character and authentic commitment to monogamous marriage. The cognitive restructuring required to maintain valuable connections to her cultural heritage, while firmly rejecting elements that had enabled her exploitation, represented a delicate balancing act that many modern Indian women faced as they navigated between treasured tradition and contemporary awareness of individual rights. Dating experiences that Anita eventually began after 2 full years of intensive therapy and recovery were complicated by persistent hypervigilance about potential deception and somewhat compulsive investigation of men's backgrounds, and social media presence that sometimes created barriers to authentic connection, though her therapist helped her recognize that some degree of careful vetting represented entirely appropriate self-protection rather than pathological mistrust. The gradual process of learning to distinguish between healthy caution based on past traumatic experience and excessive suspicion that prevented any possibility of intimate relationship required ongoing therapeutic work and tremendous patience with herself as she navigated complex emotional territory between legitimate self-protection and necessary openness to potential partners who might genuinely deserve her trust and affection. Advocacy work that Anita engaged in through women's organizations focused on raising widespread awareness about fraud in arranged marriages and supporting important legislative reforms that would create much stronger legal protections for victims, while also significantly enhancing penalties for perpetrators who exploited traditional marriage processes to deceive and harm innocent women. The public speaking she eventually undertook, despite considerable discomfort about sharing personal details of her trauma, reflected her deep conviction that remaining silent would enable continued victimization of other women by predatory men who clearly understood that cultural pressures toward reputation management often successfully intimidated their victims into protecting abusers from appropriate legal and social consequences. The relationship that Anita developed with Rohan, a software engineer she met through mutual friends 3 years after her annulment, required conscious and sustained effort to manage anxiety and resist strong impulses to sabotage potential happiness based on past trauma that had absolutely nothing to do with this genuinely honest and patient man who demonstrated remarkable understanding of her need for complete transparency and constant reassurance during early stages of their relationship. The healing that occurred through this gradually developing relationship ultimately proved that despite devastating betrayal and lasting psychological scars, authentic love and trust remained genuinely possible when both partners maintained unwavering commitment to honesty, respected each other's vulnerability, and prioritized emotional safety over performance or manipulation. The wedding that Anita and Rohan eventually celebrated was deliberately small and intimate, with only immediate family members and close friends attending a simple ceremony that emphasized genuine emotional commitment over elaborate social performance, representing Anita's conscious choice to reclaim marriage as sacred institution based on authentic love and mutual respect, rather than allowing Vikram's betrayal to permanently poison her ability to participate in cultural traditions that still held deep meaning when practiced with true integrity and honest intention. Long-term impact of Vikram's betrayal on Anita's psychological development included both significant negative consequences, like persistent hypervigilance, and ongoing trust difficulties that affected various relationships, and unexpected growth in crucial areas, including emotional resilience, critical thinking about cultural institutions, and enhanced capacity to support other trauma survivors through deep empathetic understanding of how sophisticated deception could devastate even highly intelligent and naturally cautious individuals. Recognition that her experience of fraud and subsequent recovery had equipped her with unique insights and capabilities that could genuinely benefit others, provided some sense that her suffering had not been entirely meaningless, though this philosophical perspective required many years of intensive therapeutic work and could never fully compensate for the trauma she had endured through Vikram's calculated exploitation. Information that eventually reached Anita 5 years after her annulment indicated that Vikram had married Meera in a quiet civil ceremony after his family had finally accepted that his relationship with his mistress would not end, and that further attempts to arrange traditional matches would likely result in similar failures and additional public scandals that would further damage their family reputation. The news provoked complex emotional responses in Anita, including residual anger about the fundamental injustice of seeing the two people who had conspired to harm her apparently achieving the domestic arrangement they had always desired, combined with grim satisfaction that they would now inevitably experience the consequences of building a relationship foundation on betrayal and deception, including the permanent knowledge that their union had been established through deliberate cruelty toward an innocent woman whose suffering had directly facilitated their desired outcome. Philosophical perspective that Anita developed through years of intensive therapy and sustained reflection emphasized that justice was not always served through external punishment or visible suffering of perpetrators, but rather through victims' success in rebuilding meaningful lives that demonstrated resilience and absolute refusal to allow betrayal to permanently destroy their capacity for happiness and authentic connection with others. The peace that eventually came from releasing obsessive focus on whether Vikram and Meera were experiencing appropriate consequences for their actions represented an important milestone in her recovery process, allowing her to redirect precious emotional energy toward her own well-being and relationships, rather than remaining psychologically attached to people who had long ago forfeited any legitimate claim on her attention or concern. Research that Anita conducted into the actual prevalence of fraud in arranged marriages revealed deeply disturbing patterns, suggesting that her experience was far from unique, with substantial numbers of women discovering after marriage that their husbands had systematically concealed existing relationships, deliberately misrepresented their character or values, or had been essentially coerced by families into matches they never genuinely accepted or intended to honor. The systematic nature of these widespread problems pointed to significant structural issues within traditional arranged marriage processes that prioritized surface compatibility and family approval over deeper evaluation of genuine commitment and authentic emotional connection, creating vulnerabilities that predatory individuals could readily exploit through sophisticated deception and skilled performance. Policy advocacy that grew directly from this research included specific recommendations for enhanced disclosure requirements during marriage negotiations, comprehensive legal reforms to address fraud in procurement of marriage contracts, and substantially improved support services for victims who discovered betrayal after relocating or making other major life changes based on false representations about partners' character and commitment. The legislative progress that resulted from coordinated advocacy efforts by multiple women's organizations working together demonstrated that personal tragedy could sometimes catalyze meaningful social change when survivors successfully channeled their pain into systematic efforts to protect future potential victims from similar exploitation. Professional success that Anita achieved in her Bangalore pharmacy position included promotion to department supervisor, overseeing a team of 8 pharmacists, and widespread recognition from hospital administration for her innovative patient education programs that significantly improved medication adherence rates among chronic disease patients. This success demonstrated that despite the substantial career disruption caused by Vikram's fraud, her underlying capabilities and dedication to pharmaceutical care had enabled her to rebuild professional momentum and achieve recognition that vindicated her difficult decision to prioritize personal dignity and well-being over social pressure to remain silent about marital betrayal. Family relationships that had been strained by the scandal and its aftermath gradually healed as both immediate and extended relatives came to recognize that Anita's handling of the situation had required tremendous courage and that her refusal to accept mistreatment had ultimately protected family honor more authentically than silent tolerance of Vikram's betrayal would ever have accomplished. The pride that her parents eventually expressed about her strength and her advocacy work represented meaningful repair of guilt and confusion that had complicated their relationship immediately following the annulment, when they had struggled with their own sense of responsibility for having approved a match that resulted in such devastating consequences for their beloved daughter. Mentorship relationships that Anita developed with younger women currently navigating arranged marriage processes included practical guidance about appropriate investigation techniques, specific warning signs of potential deception that families often missed, and concrete strategies for maintaining individual agency within traditional frameworks that sometimes pressured women to defer excessively to family preferences or potential partners' representations. The heartfelt gratitude expressed by women who felt empowered by this guidance to ask difficult questions or decline matches that raised legitimate concerns provided Anita with a profound sense of purpose and contribution that helped transform her trauma into a meaningful legacy of protection and education for others who might otherwise fall victim to similar exploitation. The perspective that Anita Reddy gained from surviving Vikram's betrayal and successfully rebuilding her life over 8 years following her escape from Delhi included hard-won wisdom about the complex relationships between cultural tradition and individual well-being, the critical importance of maintaining personal agency even within collective decision-making frameworks, and the sobering reality that no amount of careful investigation could ever provide absolute protection against sophisticated predators who had mastered the art of deception through extensive practice and calculated manipulation of expectations. The recognition that vulnerability was inherent in authentic relationship building rather than evidence of personal failure or inadequate caution represented a crucial cognitive shift that allowed her to eventually risk intimacy with Rohan despite ongoing awareness that trust always involved the genuine possibility of betrayal. The marriage that Anita built with Rohan demonstrated that authentic partnership based on mutual respect, transparent communication, and genuine emotional commitment could provide healing experiences that helped resolve lingering trauma from Vikram's betrayal, though complete recovery remained elusive, as certain triggers continued to provoke anxiety responses even within the safety of an honest relationship. Rohan's patience with these ongoing effects of past trauma reflected his deep understanding that psychological healing occurred gradually and incompletely, and that truly loving someone meant accepting their whole history, including wounds that would never entirely disappear, despite best therapeutic efforts and passage of considerable time. The advocacy organization that Anita co-founded with other survivors of marital fraud provided systematic support for women experiencing similar betrayals, while also conducting important research and policy work aimed at strengthening legal protections and enhancing cultural awareness about sophisticated deception techniques that exploited traditional arranged marriage processes. The organization's success in supporting hundreds of women through crisis and recovery, while also influencing legislative reforms in multiple Indian states, demonstrated that collective action by survivors could create meaningful change that protected future generations from exploitation that had previously been enabled by shame, silence, and inadequate legal frameworks. Educational programs that the organization developed included comprehensive workshops for families conducting arranged marriage negotiations, specialized training for lawyers and judges handling annulment cases, and public awareness campaigns, challenging cultural narratives that blamed victims for betrayals perpetrated by sophisticated predators who consciously chose to exploit others' trust and vulnerability. The systematic approach to prevention and response reflected recognition that individual cases of fraud occurred within broader social contexts that either enabled or deterred predatory behavior depending on whether perpetrators believed they would face serious consequences or could rely on victims' silence and cultural pressure to protect their reputations. Research publications that emerged from the organization's documentation of fraud patterns contributed to academic understanding of psychological manipulation techniques and social factors that created vulnerability to exploitation within traditional arranged marriage contexts, while also providing empirical foundation for policy recommendations and legal reforms. The international attention that this research attracted demonstrated that issues of marital fraud and betrayal transcended specific cultural contexts, while also manifesting in distinctive ways depending on particular social institutions, and expectations that predatory individuals learn to manipulate for their own purposes. Personal healing that Anita experienced through advocacy work and her marriage to Rohan never entirely erased the scars left by Vikram's calculated cruelty and Mira's complicity in deceiving and mocking someone whose only mistake had been trusting that people who made sacred vows and accepted family approval meant what they promised about building authentic partnership. The lingering anger and grief about having been treated with such contempt during what should have been the beginning of beautiful shared future represented wounds that would always remain part of her psychological landscape, though their intensity gradually diminished as she built new memories and relationships that demonstrated the genuine possibility of love and respect between partners who chose honestly to honor their commitments. The legacy of Anita's experience extended far beyond her individual recovery to include systemic improvements in how Indian society approached arranged marriages, legal protections for fraud victims, and cultural conversations about balancing traditional values with contemporary awareness of manipulation techniques that sophisticated predators employed to exploit systems designed to facilitate authentic partnership formation. The transformation of personal tragedy into meaningful social contribution represented triumph of resilience and purpose over victimization, demonstrating that even devastating betrayal could ultimately serve as catalyst for positive change when survivors refused to remain silent about their experiences and instead channeled their pain into protecting others from similar exploitation. The story of Anita Reddy serves as both warning about the sophisticated nature of modern deception within traditional contexts and inspiration about the human capacity to survive traumatic betrayal while rebuilding meaningful lives that honor both personal dignity and cultural heritage. Her journey from naive bride who trusted that arranged marriage processes would protect her, through devastating discovery of comprehensive fraud and violent intimidation, to advocate and survivor who helped create systematic change, demonstrates that individual courage combined with collective action can transform even the most painful experiences into forces for protection and education that benefit entire communities struggling with how to preserve valuable traditions, while also addressing their vulnerability to exploitation by predatory individuals who understand how to manipulate expectations and abuse trust for selfish purposes.